She was 43 years old, alone, and standing in the rain outside a house that no longer belonged to her. Her husband's cousin, a hard-eyed man named Thaddeus Hutchins, had waited exactly 11 days after the funeral before telling her the farm was his by law and she was welcome to take her trunk and go. What little she had left in this world came to $40.60, folded into a handkerchief and pinned inside her coat. And so, with nowhere else to turn, she rode 2 days into the mountains to a county recorder's office and paid $18 in back taxes to claim the one thing no one else wanted, the deed to a dead mining camp that had been quietly erased from every county map for 25 years. Folks who remembered it at all called it foolish, called it cursed, called it a waste of a widow's last coin. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that something had been sealed beneath that camp long before she was born, something that would not only save her life but would finally answer the question this whole county had been too afraid to ask for a quarter of a century. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Hutchins. If you're watching this from a place that everyone else has already given up on, tell us where you're writing from in the comments below. Naomi had been born Naomi Cray, in the spring of 1843, in a cabin at the foot of the Wasatch Range where her father ran a small forge and her mother kept bees. She was the second of 4 children, and the only one who took to her father's trade the way a fish takes to water. While her brothers chased rabbits and her sister learned to sew, Naomi stood at her father's elbow at the age of 7, small hands wrapped around a bellows twice her size, watching iron go from stubborn and cold to glowing and obedient under the right kind of patience. Her father, a quiet Welshman named Evan Cray, used to tell her that iron was honest. It never pretended to be softer than it was, and it never gave up its shape to a man who didn't respect the fire. Learn to read the fire, he told her, and the iron will never lie to you. It was a lesson she carried the rest of her life, long after the forge and the bees and her father himself were gone. Her mother, Ilsa, had come west from a Pennsylvania mining family, and it was from her that Naomi learned the other half of what would matter later, not the working of iron, but the reading of rock. Ilsa's own father had died in a coal seam collapse when she was a girl, and rather than raising her daughter to fear the earth, she had raised her to understand it, so that fear might be replaced with respect. She taught Naomi to recognize the seams that ran true and the ones that ran false, to listen for the particular silence that came before a shaft gave way, to know that timber set at the wrong angle was a promise of disaster no matter how confidently a foreman spoke. It was strange knowledge for a girl to carry into her adult life, knowledge that had no obvious use for a farmer's wife, and for 2 decades Naomi assumed her mother had simply been passing down old grief in the shape of caution. She did not yet understand that her mother had been arming her. At 19, Naomi married a gentle, unambitious man named Silas Hutchins, a distant cousin of the Hutchins family that farmed the valley below Larkspur Gulch, and for 22 years the two of them built a quiet, sufficient life together, wheat in good years, hogs in lean ones, and no children, a sorrow they had long since learned to carry without speaking of it aloud. Silas was not a hard worker in the way his brother Thaddeus was hard, all bluster and calculation, but he was steady, and he loved her plainly, and for most of those years that was enough. Naomi kept the household accounts, doctored the animals, and on more than one occasion repaired the plow's iron fittings herself rather than pay the smith in town, drawing on lessons a decade forgotten until her hands remembered them without her mind's permission. Neighbors called her capable. Her mother-in-law, before she passed, had called her the only Hutchins with any sense at all, which was not entirely a compliment to the rest of the family, and which Thaddeus never forgave her for repeating at the woman's own wake. There was one particular winter, some 9 years into her marriage, that Naomi would remember often in the years that followed, though at the time it had seemed like nothing more than an ordinary hardship. A blight had taken half the county's wheat, and money was scarce enough that Silas had gone quiet and withdrawn in the way gentlemen sometimes do when they cannot provide the way they wish to. Naomi had taken in mending and, when that was not enough, had walked 3 miles into town twice a week to help the blacksmith there, a widower named Otto Reinhold who remembered her father's reputation and was glad enough for a set of steady hands, even hands that belonged to a farmer's wife rather than an apprentice. She never told Silas how much of that winter's flour and salt pork had come from coin she earned at Reinhold's forge rather than from the farm itself, understanding without being told that a proud man's dignity was sometimes a thing worth protecting even at the cost of a small deception. It was in that forge, relearning her father's old lessons with adult hands, that she first understood iron was not the only thing in the world that could be read this way, that people, too, showed you their honest shape only under a certain kind of pressure, and that the trick was never to flinch from the heat long enough to see it. Her mother, in her final years, had grown quieter about the mining disaster that had taken her own father, but not entirely silent, and it was during one of those late conversations, not long before Ilse Cray passed, that she told Naomi something her daughter would not fully understand until decades later, sitting alone in a ruined mining camp with a stranger's ledger in her lap. Companies, Ilse had said, do not fear a widow's grief. They have seen 1,000 widows grieve and buried the sound of it under paperwork before the first frost. What a company fears, she said, is a widow who can read rock, read timber, read the small lies men tell each other in company ledgers when they think no one honest is looking. Naomi had laughed at the time, thinking her mother was simply proud of the strange education she had given her daughter. She did not laugh when she remembered those words standing before the sealed timbers of the journey's end shaft, a quarter century later, understanding for the first time exactly what her mother had been preparing her for. The trouble had always been the matter of the deed. Silas's father had left the farm jointly to his 2 sons with the understanding, spoken but never written, that whichever brother had no living children would see his share pass eventually to the other's line. Thaddeus had 4 sons of his own and considered this arrangement not a kindness but a debt owed to him personally, and he watched Silas and Naomi's childless household the way a man watches a fruit tree he expects to inherit. When Silas died of a fever in the winter of 1885, quickly and without warning, Thaddeus did not wait even a full season of mourning before producing a lawyer from the county seat and a paper that reassigned the farm's operating rights to himself, citing debts Silas had supposedly owed him, debts Naomi had never seen recorded anywhere, debts that existed, she suspected, only on the day her husband stopped being able to argue against them. The county judge, an old friend of Thaddeus's from the war, found the paper sufficiently persuasive. Naomi was given 11 days to gather her belongings. She did not weep in front of him. She had learned that much from her father's iron, you did not show a man like Thaddeus where the heat could reach you. She packed her mother's few books, her father's smallest hammer, a good winter coat, and the money she and Silas had kept hidden in a tin behind the flour barrel, money Thaddeus either did not know about or did not think to look for. $40.60. It was, she understood clearly, not enough to start anything and not little enough to simply vanish into. It was exactly enough to make one serious decision and live inside the consequences of it. She thought first of taking a room in town and hiring herself out as a seamstress or a cook, and she might have done it, had she not overheard, in the dry goods store 2 days before she was due to leave the farm, 2 old miners arguing about a piece of land nobody wanted. One of them, a whiskered relic named Orville Teague, was trying to convince the county clerk that the back taxes on a certain parcel up in the eastern hills ought to simply be forgiven, since no sane person would ever claim it. The clerk disagreed on principle but not on substance. The parcel in question, he said, was the old Journey's End claim, what remained of a mining camp that had operated for less than 4 years back in the early 60s before the shaft collapsed and killed somewhere around 40 men, after which the whole camp had been abandoned so completely and so fast that the county, embarrassed by the disaster and eager to be rid of the liability, had simply stopped listing it on any survey map at all. It had not been marked as closed or condemned. It had simply ceased, administratively, to exist, the way a name is struck from a ledger. Something in Naomi went very still when she heard this. She did not believe in ghosts, and she was not a sentimental woman, but she had grown up under a mother who taught her that the earth remembered everything a man tried to bury in it, whether stone, or grief, or gold. $18 in back taxes, the clerk said, would clear the claim and pass the deed to whoever was willing to pay it and put their name on a property that half the county considered cursed. Naomi walked to the counter, laid down the coin before she had fully decided to, and signed her name, her own name, Naomi Hutchins, not her husband's ghost, not Thaddeus's charity, to the only piece of paper in the world that was entirely and legally hers. The men in the store laughed, not unkindly, the way you laugh at a child who has just traded a good coat for a handful of colored glass. Orville Teague, who had worked the Journey's End claim as a boy of 15 before the collapse and had never gone back up that road since, did not laugh. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she would not understand until much later, and he said only, "You be careful up there, ma'am. Some ground don't forget what was done to it." She thanked him for the warning and did not, in her heart, take it seriously. She had $40 minus 18, a claim to a dead camp nobody wanted, and nowhere else in the world that wanted her either. It seemed, on that particular gray afternoon, like the least foolish decision available to her. The road up to Journey's End had not been maintained in a generation, and Naomi's borrowed mule picked its way over washed-out switchbacks for the better part of a day before the trees opened onto what had once been a town. She had expected ruins, and ruins were what she found, but there was something in the particular quality of their abandonment that unsettled her more than she expected. A whole camp, a cookhouse, a company store, a long bunkhouse, a scattering of smaller cabins, a chapel no larger than a parlor, sat exactly as it must have looked the week it emptied, doors left open, a rusted coffee pot still hung over a cold hearth, as though everyone had walked out for a single afternoon and simply never returned. There was no violence in the wreckage, only weather. 25 years of snow and sun had done what fire and looting had not. It was the stillness of a held breath, and Naomi, unpacking her mule in the fading light, found herself speaking aloud to fill the silence, the way a person talks to a house they are not yet sure is empty. She spent her first days doing what she knew how to do, assessing, the way her mother had taught her to assess a shaft before trusting it. The mine entrance itself, cut into the hillside above the camp, had been sealed with heavy timber crossbeams and packed earth, deliberately and thoroughly, in a manner that struck her immediately as strange. A collapse from natural causes left rubble, chaos, the violent evidence of rock giving way all at once. This was not that. This was a door that had been shut, on purpose, by careful hands, and then reinforced as though someone had wanted to be certain it never opened again. She stood before it a long while on her third morning, running her palm over timber gone silver gray with age, and heard her father's voice in her memory as clearly as if he stood beside her. Iron never lies to a person who respects the fire. She wondered, not for the first time, whether the earth kept the same rule. It was in the company store, going through drawers in search of anything useful, nails, tools, cloth, anything that might be salvaged and sold to keep her through the coming winter, that she found the first real thread of the mystery that would consume the following months of her life. Behind a false panel at the back of a supply cabinet, so poorly concealed that she suspected it had been meant to be found by someone specific rather than hidden from everyone, she discovered a small oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Inside was a single miner's paybook, half burned at one edge as though someone had tried and failed to destroy it, and a folded scrap of paper bearing a hand-drawn map of the camp with a section of the hillside marked in a small, careful X, along with 3 words written in a shaking hand, "For the widows." Naomi sat on the floor of that ruined store for a long time with the paybook open in her lap, reading names she did not know, Corrigan, Vasquez, Whitfield, Okafor, Bell, each entry showing wages earned and, disturbingly, wages never paid, some going back months before the collapse. Whoever had hidden this bundle had wanted someone, someday, to know that men had died owed money, and that someone had intended, before he could finish the task, to make certain their families received what was theirs. The deepening of the mystery came slowly, over the weeks that followed, the way a wound reveals its true depth only once the bleeding has stopped and the flesh can be properly examined. Naomi began to understand that Journey's End had not been an ordinary mining disaster, forgotten by an indifferent county out of simple embarrassment, but something closer to a crime that had been very deliberately smoothed over. She found, in the ruins of what had been the foreman's cabin, a second cache of documents, this one hidden inside a false bottom in an old sea chest, protected well enough by cedar and oilcloth that mice and damp had spared most of the pages. These were letters, dozens of them, written by a man named Josiah Bell, foreman of the Journey's End claim in its final year, addressed to the mine's owners, a company based out of Denver called the Ironwood Concern. In letter after letter, Bell had warned, with increasing desperation, that the eastern shaft's timber supports were rotted and undersized for the depth they had reached, that water was seeping into the lower gallery faster than it could be pumped, that the men working the deep face were afraid and had every right to be. The last letter, dated only 4 days before the collapse, was the one that made Naomi's hands go cold as she read it in the fading light of a September evening. Josiah Bell had written that the ironwood concern's own hired engineer, a man named Griggs, had inspected the shaft and confirmed everything Bell feared, and had recommended immediate closure of the deep gallery until proper supports could be installed. And beneath that, in a different hand, someone at the Ironwood Concern's Denver office had written back, in a note that had apparently been returned attached to Bell's own letter as though flung back in his face, "The vein does not close for weather guessing. Get the ore out before the snow." The collapse had come 6 days later. 41 men had been in the deep gallery. None had come out. And rather than face the reckoning that Bell's letters would have demanded, rather than pay what was owed to 41 families, rather than answer for an engineer's warning ignored in the name of a few more weeks of ore, the Ironwood Concern had done something almost breathtaking in its coldness. They had sent men to seal the shaft entrance permanently within a week of the disaster, quietly paid off the county to strike Journey's End from every official map and survey, listed the camp in their own company ledgers as discontinued, unproductive, and simply walked away, leaving no trace that 41 men had ever died there at all. The widows Josiah Bell had tried to protect had, as far as Naomi could determine from the scattered letters and records she found, never received a cent, because as far as any official record showed, there had been no disaster to compensate. There had, officially, been no Journey's End. Naomi sat with this knowledge for 3 full days before she allowed herself to think about what the small hand-drawn map and its X on the hillside might mean. Josiah Bell, it seemed, had understood in his final days exactly what the company intended to do, and had taken some measure of the wages and supplies entrusted to him, cash the company itself had shipped up for a coming payroll that never arrived in time, and hidden it somewhere on the hillside, along with his letters, in the desperate hope that someday, somehow, someone honest would find it and finish what he could not. Whether Bell himself had died in the collapse or lived long enough to hide the bundle and then perished from grief or shame, Naomi never determined for certain, though Orville Teague, when she rode down to ask him some weeks later, wept openly at the mention of the man's name and told her that Josiah Bell had in fact survived the collapse. He had been above ground that day, laid up with a broken ankle, and had spent his last 8 months alive trying and failing to get anyone in the county or in Denver to listen to him, before he was found dead of his own hand at the sealed mine entrance the following spring, a note in his pocket that the county coroner had ruled unremarkable and filed away without a second thought. It took Naomi the better part of a month, working alone with a pick and a lantern and the patient, methodical care her mother had drilled into her as a girl, to find the location the map described, not inside the sealed shaft itself, which she had no intention of disturbing, but in a small side cave some 40 yards along the hillside, concealed behind a rockfall that had clearly been arranged by hand rather than by nature. What she found there, wrapped in oilcloth and canvas and remarkably well preserved by the dry mountain air, was a strongbox containing just over $3,000 in coin and company scrip, a ledger in Josiah Bell's own hand recording every man's unpaid wages down to the penny, copies of his warning letters and the company's damning reply, and a final page, added last, in which Bell had written out, plainly and without self-pity, exactly what he believed had happened and exactly what he hoped someone would someday do about it. Naomi read that final page by lantern light with tears finally allowed to fall, 25 years too late for the man who wrote it, and understood that she was no longer simply a widow squatting on a cursed claim. She was, whether she wanted the burden or not, the only person alive who could finish Josiah Bell's unfinished work. Word travels strangely in mountain counties, and it was not long before word traveled that the Hutchins widow up at the old Journey's End claim had found something. Naomi had been careful, she thought, telling no one but Orville Teague the full extent of what she'd uncovered, and swearing him to silence, but silence is a fragile currency in a place where everyone owes everyone else a favor, and within 6 weeks a man arrived at the camp on a fine horse, wearing a coat too clean for mountain roads, introducing himself as Everett Ironwood, grandson of the concern's founder and now its principal owner. He was courteous in the particular way of men who have never had to be anything else, and he informed Naomi, with the warm patience one might use on a confused child, that the Journey's End claim, county tax deed notwithstanding, remained subject to certain historical mineral rights retained by the ironwood concern, and that any materials, documents, company property, or otherwise, found on the site rightfully belonged to his family's company. He offered her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, $400 for whatever she had found and her signature on a paper agreeing to vacate the claim entirely. Naomi had spent enough years watching her father judge the honesty of iron by the way it behaved under pressure to recognize immediately that Everett Ironwood was terrified, and that his fear was the most valuable information he could have given her. She told him, politely, that she would need time to consider the offer, and she spent that time not considering it at all but instead riding, alone and in secret, down to the county seat, where she paid a young lawyer named Cornelius Faraday, new to town, hungry for a case that mattered, and refreshingly unconnected to Thaddeus Hutchins's circle of old war friends, to review every document she had found and advise her on what, precisely, the law required a company to do when it had concealed the deaths of 41 men for a quarter of a century. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Naomi's life since the funeral, harder in some ways than the funeral itself, because grief at least asks nothing of you but endurance, while a fight for justice asks you to keep standing up after every door closes in your face. Everett Ironwood, once his polite offer was refused, showed the county what money can buy in a place where money has always bought quiet. He leaned on the same judge who had ruled against Naomi's claim to her own farm. He spread word through the valley that the widow up at Journey's End was unstable, grief-mad, digging up old bones better left buried, and he found, unsurprisingly, a ready ally in Thaddeus Hutchins himself, who saw in his cousin's widow's sudden notoriety both an embarrassment to the family name and an opportunity, since a woman ruled incompetent by the court might have her remaining claims, including that troublesome deed to Journey's End, reassigned to her nearest male relative. Thaddeus filed a petition. The two men who had wronged Naomi in entirely separate corners of her life discovered, with the swiftness of vultures finding the same carcass, that their interests aligned perfectly. There were nights that autumn when Naomi sat alone in the boarding-house room she had rented in the county seat, the ledger and letters locked in a strongbox beside her bed, and allowed herself to wonder whether she had made a terrible mistake. Letters arrived, unsigned, warning her that a woman without family standing behind her ought to consider carefully what accidents could befall a lone claim in the high country come winter. A man she did not recognize followed her at a careful distance through the streets of the county seat for the better part of a week, never quite close enough to accost her, close enough that she stopped sleeping soundly. Orville Teague, the only man in the valley who had stood by her plainly and without hesitation, had his small trapping cabin broken into and searched, though nothing of value was taken, which told them both exactly what the intruders had been looking for and exactly how close Everett Ironwood believed he was to finding it. It would have been easy, in those weeks, to accept the $400, to sign the paper, to disappear quietly back into the kind of small, careful life the world seemed determined to allow a widow like her. Naomi thought often of Josiah Bell's final page, of a man who had spent 8 months alone trying to get anyone to listen before he gave up entirely, and she found in his exhaustion not a warning to quit but a debt she owed him to finish what his own courage, spent too soon, had not been enough to complete. But Naomi Hutchins had learned to read fire, and she had learned to read stone, and over the course of that hard autumn she learned, with Cornelius Faraday's patient tutoring, to read the law as well. Rather than waiting for the county's hearing on her competency, she rode to Denver herself, ledger and letters in a locked case chained to her wrist, and requested, and after 3 days of being turned away, finally secured, a meeting with the editor of the Rocky Mountain News. A man who understood immediately that a story about a company burying 41 dead men to save the cost of proper timber supports was worth considerably more to his readership than any favor Everett Ironwood might offer to bury it instead. The story ran on a Sunday, above the fold, under the headline that the whole territory would be repeating within the week, "The camp that never was, 25 years of silence over Journey's End." The reckoning that followed was not the swift, satisfying kind found in dime novels, but it was real, and it was thorough. The county judge, suddenly the subject of newspaper scrutiny regarding his long friendship with both Thaddeus Hutchins and the Ironwood concern, recused himself from both pending petitions rather than face a formal inquiry, and his replacement, a stern circuit judge with no ties to anyone in the valley, dismissed Thaddeus's competency petition within a single hearing, describing it in his written ruling as transparently opportunistic. Everett Ironwood, facing public disgrace and the very real threat of criminal negligence charges his own grandfather's old lawyers could not entirely bury, agreed to a settlement rather than risk a trial, full and immediate payment, with interest calculated across 25 years, of every wage recorded in Josiah Bell's ledger, to be distributed to the surviving families of the 41 men who died at Journey's End, wherever they could still be found. Naomi spent the following spring doing the finding herself, traveling by rail and by wagon to towns across 3 territories, sitting at kitchen tables with widows now old themselves, or with the grown children of men they had barely known, placing into their hands money that had been owed to their fathers and husbands for a quarter of a century, along with, in every case, a copy of the page Josiah Bell had written the night he hid it all away, so that they would know their people had not been forgotten, only silenced, and that the silence was finally broken. As for Thaddeus Hutchins, karma arrived for him not through any dramatic reversal but through the much quieter, much more permanent justice of a community's memory. Word of what he had attempted, trying to have his own cousin's widow declared incompetent for the crime of exposing a company's cover-up of 41 deaths, spread through the valley with the particular relish that small communities reserve for the unmasking of a man who has always presented himself as respectable. Farmhands who once tipped their hats to him began finding reasons to look elsewhere. The bank that had comfortably extended him credit for years suddenly found his applications required additional review. He kept the farm, in the end, because the law allowed him to keep it, but he kept it as a man kept something he was ashamed to be seen enjoying, and Naomi, when she thought of him at all in the years that followed, found she did not need him punished by fate. She had already watched him lose the one thing he had always claimed to value more than money, the good opinion of his neighbors. Naomi herself did not use a single dollar of the settlement money for herself beyond what her lawyer's fees required, a fact the newspapers made a great deal of and which she found, privately, unremarkable. The money had never been hers to keep, only hers to deliver, the way her father had taught her that iron did not belong to the smith but only passed briefly through his honest hands on its way to becoming something useful. What she did keep, and what she built her remaining years around, was Journey's End itself, which she resettled not as a mine but as a town in its own right, rebuilding the cookhouse into a boarding house, the chapel into an actual working chapel, and placing at the mouth of the sealed shaft a modest stone marker bearing all 41 names, carved by her own hand with tools that had once belonged to her father, so that the ground which had once been erased from every map in the county would never again be permitted to disappear. It is worth returning, now, to where we began, to a 43-year-old widow standing in the rain outside a house that was no longer hers, $40 pinned inside her coat, about to spend 18 of it on a piece of ground everyone else considered cursed and worthless. It would have been easy, looking at her in that moment, to see only what Thaddeus Hutchins saw, a woman with nothing, making a desperate and foolish decision because desperate and foolish decisions were all that remained available to her. But Naomi Hutchins had spent her whole life being underestimated in exactly this way, first as a girl too small for a blacksmith's bellows, then as a childless wife whose worth her own family measured only against her husband's, and each time, she had answered that underestimation not with anger but with patience, with the quiet, stubborn insistence on reading a situation honestly before anyone else bothered to look closely enough to read it at all. The camp that everyone called cursed was not cursed. It was simply unfinished, a story interrupted mid-sentence by men who found the truth inconvenient, and it had been waiting 25 years for someone with the particular combination of skills, patience, and nothing left to lose that only Naomi possessed. She did not restore Journey's End because she was owed a fortune. She restored it because Josiah Bell had asked, in the last honest words he ever wrote, for someone to finish what he could not, and because her mother had taught her, decades before it mattered, that the earth remembers everything a man tries to bury in it, and it is usually waiting for someone patient enough, and honest enough, to dig. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Naomi's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs a reminder that what looks worthless to everyone else can still be waiting for the right person to see its true value. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real worth in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of your stories, and they mean more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close.